once said, all sincere prayers are granted, every call is answered. This is a short reflection on what is a sincere prayer. Prayer, as we know, is one of the most common practices we have to connect with the divine, to establish a relation with the divine. Whether it is for any small personal object or some larger and less self-centered one, most of us have often called and prayed to some higher power or higher being, someone who we feel has the power to grant our wish. Of course, from a spiritual point of view, it is not in our limited human capability to know whether a prayer should be granted or not. Only the divine knows what is truly needed for the aspirant, and that the divine gives. In our wiser moments, of course, we also know that when our prayer is not granted, it is actually the compassion and grace of that same higher wisdom which is behind the denial. So, but the very act of praying becomes a moment, a conscious act to consciously connect with the divine. So, as we find that as our prayer becomes less and less egoistic and more an expression of gratitude, thanksgiving, and love for the divine, that's a sign that our relation with the divine is also becoming more intimate, it is deepening. So, what exactly is sincere prayer, and what does it mean when Mother says that all sincere prayers are granted? I remember an old Hindustani / Urdu couplet, a verse that I had heard many years back, actually when I was a child, and it has been sort of etched in my memory since then. I don't know who had written it or where I read it or heard it for the first time, but it has stayed with me. And what the verse goes something like this. Um, दुआ मंजूर होती है अगर वो दिल से होती है, मगर मुश्किल बस इतनी है कि वो मुश्किल से होती है. Roughly, this could be translated as a prayer is answered when it is from the heart. The only difficulty is that it happens with difficulty. So I'm just going to use this to kind of understand what I can make out of this in terms of what is a sincere prayer. So what the poet, sort of unnamed, anonymous poet who composed this verse is saying, the way I understand it, is that to pray with utmost sincerity, utmost complete devotion and faith, that is what is meant by praying really from the heart. And that is the only difficulty. Because it happens with difficulty, our prayers are not granted. If one can do that kind of an utmost sincere prayer from that deepest part of the heart, the prayer is granted. That is what the Mother is also saying. All sincere prayers are granted. So there is certainly, when the poet is speaking of difficulty, there is a reference to that personal effort, the personal aspiration that goes into that calling by the seeker, the aspiration of the seeker. This is what the poet is also probably referring to, that for the prayer to be granted, one has to make that effort that can ease the difficulty of the possibility of the granting of the prayer. So it has to come from that deepest, that sincerest part of the heart, which is not the emotive heart as we commonly understand, which is full of passions and impulses and moved by all kinds of impulses and is seeking its own satisfaction of petty desires and petty demands. Rather, it is more of that deepest part which is more and more close to the psychic. It is actually psychic in us that is, that is reflecting in the heart that is purified and beyond the limited egoistic consciousness. And to get to that part of the heart, that's the phrase, the word that the poet is using here, dil, to get to that inmost part of the heart, which is very close to the psychic, that is the sadhana. To get in contact with the psychic, that is the sadhana of the aspirant. That is the difficulty that he's also referring to. So this purified heart is the source of that most sincere prayer. One of the things it has is a clear sight of its purpose or goal of the prayer, if you will, and that purpose is to seek only the divine and only for the sake of divine. So that is what I meant when I referred to that it is not moved by the petty demands. It is beyond the limited egoistic consciousness. And it's the prayer of offering, prayer of gratitude that for which it calls the divine. The other thing that this purified heart, that is actually more of a reflection of the psychic within, is that it has a deep, uncompromising, unfailing trust, faith and trust in the divine. And this heart knows that faith is much, much more than a mental belief which can easily waver and change. Rather, it holds on to some kind of a certitude of the soul, a spiritual certitude, Sri Aurobindo speaks of. It understands that faith is that soul's ideal, and it clings on to that even when it is not really fulfilled in life, even when the immediate facts of life or the persistent circumstances in the outer life, mind, and body continue to deny. And yet, this heart holds on to that ideal of that soul. That is the kind of faith it has. The other part of the difficulty that the poet may be referring to is, which is what we understand as the act of rejection, that as it continues on becoming more and more purified, it continues to become intuitively aware of all that it needs to reject and from which it needs to withdraw on its journey to a greater and greater purification. So it has the will to reject what needs to be rejected. And at the same time, it is keenly aware that this act of rejection is not possible without the grace and presence of the force, the mother's force, the divine Shakti. So this is another aspect, another characteristic of this purified heart, that it is fully open and receptive to the working of the power of the divine force, which is most essential in this journey of purification. So when all of these elements are there, that is when the heart can make the call from a place of truest, most sincere space within. And there is also an element of offering of itself, offering of the limitations and weaknesses of the outer human nature as well. And that is when a call like that is made to the Divine Mother, from this place of purity, from this purified heart, that is granted. That is the call that is answered, as the Mother says. So this is in fact a most gentle, most delicate form of offering of oneself, without any concern for whether this immediate object of the prayer is granted or not. And there's no pulling of any kind, no pressure of any sort that is applied to this call. There's no eagerness or impatience to this heart's prayer. That is what most sincere prayer is. There's no bargaining of any kind, like, if this is granted, then my faith will grow. That may happen as a sort of a byproduct of this experience, but there is no conscious act of bargaining like that. That is the purest, sincerest prayer. And perhaps the only motive that this prayer has, whether the seeker, whether the caller is conscious or unconscious of that, is another matter, is of uniting of one's will to the divine's will. That let what is good for me should be done by the divine force. So that motive or that intention of uniting one's will to the divine will, that becomes the very content of the prayer itself. That is the most sincere prayer, which I understand, as I understand, that's what Mother says is always granted. So at this point, let me just bring in some beautiful lines from Sri Aurobindo, where he says in his unique expression, very quintessential Sri Aurobindo, if I can use that, to get us, brings us closer to a truly deep truth about the prayer itself. And, there is also a lot of humor and cheerfulness in his expression in this particular passage. And this is important because I choose this because again, remembering what Sri Aurobindo says, cheerfulness is the salt of the sadhana. And a heart that knows how to laugh and smile and how to stay cheerful in all circumstances, that alone can experience or make the call of the most sincere prayer from a place of perfect simplicity, a perfect sincerity. So, in that sense, also, I think this passage of Sri Aurobindo connects very well when we try to understand what makes a prayer most sincere. So, I quote from Sri Aurobindo. He says, there's no hard and fast rule that can be laid down for whether a prayer is granted or not. I quote, some prayers are answered, all are not. And you may ask, why should not all prayers be answered? Why should they be? It is not a machinery, you see, but a prayer that you put a prayer in the slot and get your asking. Besides considering all the contradictory things mankind is praying for at the same moment, God would be in a rather awkward hole if he had to grant all of them. It would not do. So if we can keep this also in front and call from that place of highest sincerity and simplicity that we can muster, that place of purified heart within, that is the prayer that is always granted. Thank you.